Committee will be in order. Welcome to the full committee markup of the State Foreign Operations Bill. We're nearing the finish line of our committee work. This is the 9th bill before the committee, meaning we're nearly 75% of the way done with the committee work. And we intend to bring our 10th bill before the committee tomorrow. And as of last week, we've passed 5 of the bills off the floor and expect 2 more on the floor the week after the July 4th recess. It's remarkable progress, I think historic. And I want to thank each one of you for your hard work on your subcommittee and on the full committee, and for your commitment to returning to regular order on this committee and its business. So now, before turning our attention to the business at hand, I want to recognize Ranking Member Lowy for any general opening remarks that she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while I share the Chairman's enthusiasm for our committee's progress, we are shortchanging these priorities due to the abject failure of other committees to tackle basic issues that would grow the economy, reduce the deficit, or ease the burden of sequestration. And with weeks remaining before the end of the fiscal year, in my judgment, it's time to take stock of whether this committee and this Congress are doing enough to rebuild America's middle class, create jobs, and provide opportunity for everyone to succeed. Republicans on Ways and Means have yet to make any progress rewriting a broken tax code. The majority refuses to allow a vote on comprehensive immigration reform that would reduce the deficit by $197 billion. Republican leadership ignores the bipartisan Senate vote to extend unemployment benefits. So while House Republicans cut investments in roads and bridges that create jobs and reduce affordable housing, American families need, oil companies get taxpayer giveaways, and the Highway Trust Fund depletes, research and development programs that create good jobs and have substantial returns on investments stagnate, while unemployed Americans lose jobless benefits. While some of these appropriations bills reflect a good faith effort within this year's meager spending allocation, we must not lose sight of the bigger picture. And this committee and this Congress can do more to restore our economy and prosperity for the American people. So, Mr. Chairman, again, I share your enthusiasm, and I know that there are issues which I've discussed that may be beyond our control. So right now, I look forward to today's markup, and I do hope as we move forward, we can focus on some of the tremendous needs that are affecting the middle class in our country and do more to lift them up through the process. And I know that we will continue to work hard to get these bills through, and I look forward to working with you to be successful. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Now I recognize the chairwoman of the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee, Ms. Granger, to present the bill.
Thank the chairman for yielding and for his leadership on so many issues in the state and foreign operations bill. Also to thank Mrs. Lowy for her dedication to the subcommittee. We worked closely together to try to find solutions our members can support. We have many amendments to consider today, so I will just give a few brief highlights of this year's bill. The funding provided is $48 billion, which is $708 million below the enacted fiscal year 2014 level and $277 million less than the President's fiscal year 2015 request. To make room for many priorities within this allocation, the bill excludes funding for 11 accounts and reduces funding in other areas. A top priority this year is global health, and the bill increases funds above the request for polio and HIV/AIDS programs. The bill also maintains last year's level of funding for embassy security and construction to keep U.S. diplomats safe while they represent the United States abroad. We continued our strong commitment to Israel and Jordan and increased funding for countries in the former Soviet Union and Central and Eastern Europe. The bill rejects the poorly timed cuts proposed by the President for programs in Mexico and Central America. The bill also increases funds to combat human trafficking with a specific focus on Guatemala and supports technologies that can assist Central American countries in identifying trafficking victims. Each of these investments will help address the thousands of unaccompanied children flooding our border by improving economic opportunities and security in Latin America. However, we know that these changes will not happen overnight, and I'll continue to work with my colleagues on the committee on a comprehensive solution to the problem. The bill continues funding to combat wildlife poaching and trafficking. Many members have expressed their support for these efforts because we do not want to see unique wildlife become extinct on our watch, and we know that funds from the illegal wildlife trade fuel criminal organizations. The bill continues aid for Egypt with the expectation that the government will continue the relationship with the United States and uphold the peace treaty with Israel, and is tied to these requirements as well as other conditions related to Egypt's democratic transition. We also expect the new president to overturn the June 2013 convictions of many American and international democracy workers. The bill has tough conditions on aid to the Palestinian Authority. The bill includes a new condition: no funds can go to a Palestinian government that results from an agreement with Hamas. Since the current government was put in place because of such an agreement, the committee defers assistance for the Palestinian Authority. Aid is off the table until it's clear that the government is committed to peace and security. The bill continues to reduce assistance for Afghanistan. Funds are only provided for projects that can be sustained by the Afghan people, and the bill does not allow funds to be provided for new reconstruction, such as the large infrastructure projects that have been built over the last decade. We also do not know yet if the new government will cooperate with the United States and have conditioned funds on whether a bilateral security agreement is signed. In Iraq today, we see a real crisis unfolding, only a few short years since our troops withdrew. This bill continues the fiscal year 2014 levels for security assistance and humanitarian aid to help address these challenges. I hope that all members can support moving this bill through committee today, and I yield back to the chairman.
We'll turn now to the ranking member of the subcommittee for her remarks on the bill.
Thank you, Chairwoman Granger and Chairman Rogers. It certainly has been a pleasure, as usual, to work with our chairwoman on this bill, and I greatly appreciate your continued commitment to our development and diplomacy efforts worldwide. The agencies and programs funded by this bill are a vital part of our national security and our foreign policy. They also directly impact our ability to focus on domestic priorities like rebuilding the middle class, restoring our economy by providing stability and preventing costly security threats abroad. In the midst of great turmoil in the Middle East, vital U.S. assistance for our close allies, Israel and Jordan, remains robust. With the suspension of peace negotiations and an unreformed Hamas now supporting the Palestinian Authority's unity government, there's simply no viable partner for peace. Therefore, the bill defers funding for this Palestinian unity government. In addition, it continues prior year language on halting anti-Israel incitement, maintains the current strict conditions on any prospective assistance to the PA, requiring them to demonstrate a commitment to peace, coexistence, and security cooperation with Israel. Our diplomats and development professionals serve on the front lines of our national security strategy and deserve our full support. This bill sustains our commitment to embassy and diplomatic security. We are also increasing U.S. efforts to combat transnational crime, particularly human trafficking, including minors from Central America, and wildlife poaching. These criminal enterprises continue unabated in many regions, exploit corrupt and weak governments, provide a financing source for terrorists, and prey on young and vulnerable populations. Robust funding for basic education signals to the administration that they must prioritize education in their work with other countries, international organizations, and civil society groups. Without the skills to make positive contributions to their societies, uneducated children are powerless to overcome the greater forces that surround them, particularly poverty, conflict, disease, and even terrorism. Education is therefore fundamental to all of our other development goals, remains a moral, economic, and national security imperative. Our investments in global health programs, including PEPFAR, the Global Fund, TB, malaria, the Global Alliance for Vaccine Initiative, and nutrition, save thousands of lives each year and help stem the tide of dangerous diseases that can threaten our own borders. While this bill makes many wise investments, it unfortunately contains several odious riders that threaten to impair our ability to meet our objectives abroad. Drastic cuts in funding for family planning, a reinstatement of the global Gag Rule, a prohibition on U.S. contributions to UNFPA, are three counterproductive policies that obstruct the very goals we all want to achieve: fewer maternal deaths, unintended pregnancies, and abortions. In addition, the cuts in real terms to USAID's operating expenses could compromise staff morale and expertise at this vital agency. I will also ask committee members to provide much-needed support for female Peace Corps volunteers. Under current law, female volunteers have inferior health care coverage compared to other women representing the United States overseas. I hope you will join me in finally fixing this injustice, as the Senate did last week on a bipartisan basis. It is my sincere hope that working with the Senate, we will continue to improve this bill before its enactment. I want to express my sincere appreciation to Chairwoman Granger for her hard work. I also want to express my thanks to our staffs for their efforts on this bill: Anne Marie Chatvax, Craig Higgins, Alice Hogan, Susan Adams, Celia Alvarado, Jamie Gwynn, David Bortnick, Johnny Caberly, as well as my staff, Steve Marquez, Erin Kolodziejski, Siobhan Houlihan, Sonali Corday, and Maren Stein. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I want to commend the chairwoman and ranking member for their expert work on this bill. I know you don't agree on everything, but your work together sets a fine example for this committee and for the Congress of the good work that can be done when we work together collaboratively. So thanks both to you, to the subcommittee and the staff for all that you've done to bring this bill before us. It's clear we are facing global instability, and it's growing, including in Iraq, Ukraine, Syria, to name a few. These state and foreign operations programs remain critically important to the future of the United States and the entire world. In this bill, you've prioritized the $48.3 billion in discretionary and OCO funding on critical diplomatic efforts, the safety of Americans abroad, and our long-standing support for humanitarian aid and public health programs that will have the greatest direct impact on our national security. One of our top priorities is ensuring that our men and women serving overseas, particularly in more volatile areas, remain safe. For embassy and diplomatic security, you've provided a $46 million increase above what was requested of us. The bill provides a total of $8.5 billion for international security assistance. This critical support for our allies and international partners like Israel, Jordan, Mexico, Colombia, and the Philippines will continue our ongoing collaboration and help advance U.S. interests in these regions. This funding also continues our commitment to fighting drug trafficking, rejecting the administration's proposed cuts to counter narcotics and law enforcement efforts in Mexico, Colombia, Central America, and the Caribbean. New problems and threats arise every day, and this bill takes steps to tackle these developing issues, such as the escalating crisis of thousands of unaccompanied alien children entering through our southwest border. It's also plain that the tenuous situation in the Ukraine persists. So the bill includes $215 million above the request to support the people of Ukraine and the region, and to provide security and democracy assistance throughout this tumultuous time. In addition, I am thankful the bill includes language that allows the financing of coal-fired and other power generation projects by U.S. companies overseas, boosting American job creation and ensuring cost-effective technology for developing and other nations. At the same time, the bill recognizes an important domestic priority, cutting federal discretionary spending to a more sustainable level. With this legislation, we will have made difficult decisions to reduce funding for lower priority programs or those that we simply can't afford at this time. In total, the bill saves about $708 million compared to last year's levels. Finally, the bill includes robust oversight to improve management and tighten the reins on taxpayer dollars. And we've required tough conditions and reporting, particularly when it comes to funding for foreign governments and multi-year commitments. The bill lives up to the challenge of do more with less, and I strongly support committee approval of the bill today. Is there further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Before you do, is there further general discussion?
Opening remarks.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I have to say that I'm really proud of this committee, that our foreign policy is led by two really talented women that chair this committee. I mean, it's a great statement to the world that a democracy, and even in a male-dominated Congress, that we put the hands of our foreign affairs and the financing of our foreign affairs in these two talented women, and thank you for your service. But I raise because I'm really gravely concerned about the Latin American human rights conditions that were omitted from this bill. In the past year, the committee has included these critical human rights conditions in the bill with bipartisan support, and with good reason. The United States is a country that we all know respects the rule of law, provides citizen security, and protects human rights. Everyone in this room can agree that human rights are the linchpins of a healthy, functioning democracy. And everyone in this room should agree that the best interest of the U.S. is to ensure that the U.S. taxpayer dollars will uphold human rights here in our own hemisphere in Latin America. And I look to nearly 50,000 unaccompanied migrant children who've come to the U.S. this year from Central America. These children are literally on our doorstep due to no small part to steeply increased gang activity and widespread violence in their host country. Violence is so bad that kids, little kids, are fleeing from the, quote, join or die gang recruitment techniques, among other threats. This is a regional human rights crisis that we cannot ignore, and I appreciate the committee's attention to this critical issue. I hope we can make strong investments in violence prevention and civil society strengthening, among other things. Latin America is on the rise. Several Latin American countries' economies, GDP is stronger than that of the United States. But change takes time, and there's still more work to do, especially in the countries like Colombia, Honduras, Mexico, and Guatemala. To reduce the corruption in the foreign militaries, curb use of excessive force by public security forces, and strengthening the rule of law. Every one of you knows that I've spoken many times about my experience in the Peace Corps in Colombia, and some say I left my heart in Colombia. And you would think that I wouldn't be the last one to promote conditions that punish our allied countries. But just quite the contrary. These conditions are to provide support the government officials who are fighting to support democracy and promote the rule of law. For example, in Colombia, President Juan Manuel Santos has made landmark progress in peace talks with the FARC guerrillas. At the same time, human rights concerns remain. There are still over 2,200 cases of extrajudicial executions allegedly committed by Colombian security forces, and only 189 of those cases have obtained convictions. That's just 8%. Or take Honduras, home of the highest murder rate in the world. 34 journalists and 31 trade unionists have been killed since 2009 coup. Between 2011 and 2012, corrupt police killed 149 civilians, including 18 kids under the age of 19. And the State Department has said that corruption, intimidation, and poor functioning of the justice system were serious impediments to the protection of human rights. Even in our neighboring country, Mexico, from 2006 to 2012, there were reported 500% increase in complaints of torture and cruel treatment. In 2013 alone, 1,082 complaints of torture and ill treatment were committed by federal agents. And the number of disappeared continues to grow, hitting 16,000 in June of 2014, including 8,000 cases that occurred since President Enrique Peña Nieto took office. Without strong U.S. conditionality on human rights, there are bad actors who undermine the good efforts of this committee. We need democratic allies, and human rights are the backbone of democratic societies. With this bill, we had an opportunity to build the capacity of Latin American countries to promote human rights and to improve the lives of our allies right here in our own hemisphere. Unfortunately, the absence of these conditions hampers our capacity to promote human rights, and in so doing, to promote peace. And peace is the most effective, least costly tool in our foreign policy toolbox. I'm disappointed that this bill takes U.S. human rights policies, a human rights policy, in such a different direction, away from peace. I'm not going to offer an amendment today, but because we've been able to work this out in conference, and I'm putting the committee on notice that I hope we can work it out in conference once again. Thank you.
Gentlelady from Connecticut.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to support the comments of my colleague, Mr. Farr. As an exemplar of democracy and a leader of the free world, other nations look to us to be defenders of human rights around the globe. So it is in the moral and the democratic and national security interests of the United States to ensure that the aid and training that we provide to foreign militaries is not being used to violate basic human rights. It is also in our interest to ensure that taxpayers' dollars are not being used by foreign military forces that are corrupt or that are linked with drug traffickers. In Colombia, of the over 4,000 extrajudicial executions allegedly committed by members of the Colombian security forces, the vast majority remain unpunished. In Mexico, there were 1,815 complaints of human rights violations committed by military officials and federal police in 2013. And yet, these officials continue to reflect a lack of will and intent to hold soldiers accountable. In Honduras, abuses committed by police and military remain in impunity, and police reforms are failing. In Guatemala, the military continues to fail to fully cooperate with investigations into human rights violations committed by members of the armed forces. I believe that corruption and impunity continue to be serious problems in Latin America, and I concur with Mr. Farr that these conditions and restrictions should be in this legislation, and I look forward to working with him and others to see what we can do in terms of ensuring that our dollars are not used to facilitate the violation of human rights around the world.
Ms. Louie.
Mr. Chairman, I know of Mr. Farr's passion and commitment to these issues, which are rooted in your experience, your extensive experience working in the area, especially with the Peace Corps. And I just want to assure you that as this bill moves through the process, we will continue to consult and hopefully move the language in the direction that you so passionately addressed. And I thank you very much for raising this issue.
Mr. Honda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also rise to echo Mr. Farr's remarks. Linking human rights conditions to security assistance has made the difference, giving us the leverage to strengthen the rule of law, protect indigenous and minority communities, and encourage compliance with basic human rights standards. I do not believe that any one of us would deny human rights for any one person. As members of Congress, our voices and our ability to draw attention to human rights violations are key tools for defending human rights. In Colombia, these invaluable tools help protect the lives of human rights defenders, trade unions, and Afro-Colombian leaders. In Mexico, disappearance continues at alarming levels, and the government's effort to search for people who have been forcibly disappeared and to investigate and prosecute those responsible are inadequate. The Mexican government reported in June of 2014 that it has 16,000 people registered in its database of the disappeared. In the absence of human rights, and a community is overrun with fear and corruption. Human right is something each of us should be calling for instead of debating it here today. Doing so is not just good for our brothers and sisters in Latin America, but it's also good for our own country. After all, a safe home begins with a safe neighborhood.
Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I also would like to associate myself with the remarks of Congressman Farr and Honda and our ranking member. I, too, am concerned that this bill strips the important language included in previous years to ensure that the training that we provide foreign militaries in Latin America is not used to violate human rights. It's in the interest of the United States to ensure that aid and training that we provide to foreign militaries is not used to violate basic human rights. It's also in our interest to ensure that taxpayer dollars are not used by foreign military forces that are corrupt or linked to drug traffickers. The conditions are especially important for guaranteeing protection of rights for Afro-Colombian leaders as well as Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities. The conditions specific to Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and Colombia have been in appropriations laws for years and approved with bipartisan support. They need to be reinstated as this bill moves forward. Thank you again, and I want to thank Mr. Farr, and Ranking Member, and Mr. Honda.
There being no further general discussion, are there amendments?
Let me respond. I share some of the gentleman's concerns, and many of these issues are addressed in the bill and the accompanying report. The bill doesn't withhold funds to countries that are fighting drug violence. In many cases, these are the most violent countries in the world. But we do carry language that addresses these issues. And I look forward to working with Congressman Farr and others who express their opinions today as the bill moves forward.
Are there amendments? Chairman Granger.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Ms. Granger. In the bill on page 137 of the bill, Line 16, strike all after Iraq through
Mr.
stability.
Chairman, I ask unanimous
Without
consent to
objection, the
dispense
reading
with
is
the reading.
dispensed with, and gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the chairman. This is an amendment that Mrs. Lowy and I have worked out together, and I hope members will support it. First, I'd like to highlight what this amendment does to respond to the thousands of unaccompanied children who are coming across the border. The amendment provides $120 million above the request to enhance border security, combat human trafficking and smuggling, provide for the safe repatriation and reintegration of citizens from Mexico and Central America, and to support a regional dialogue on these issues. I know that many members are focused on this issue, and I look forward to working together as we go forward. The amendment also includes language on Iraq, private donations for a memorial site, international broadcasting, Alzheimer's disease and dementia, funding for Latin American countries, Boko Haram, and wildlife trafficking. This amendment reflects the bipartisan spirit that Mrs. Lowy and I have sought to maintain throughout the process. I urge support for the amendment. I yield back to the chairman.
Ms. Lowy?
I rise in support of this amendment, and I want to thank the chair.
Mike.
I rise again in support of this amendment, and I want to thank the chair for working with us to address a few issues that arose after the subcommittee consideration of this bill. The minority has no objection to this amendment.
Mr. Fattah?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to thank the chairwoman and the ranking member for including some in the bilateral area of assistance in the global health area, Alzheimer's and dementia. Congressman Chris Smith and I have a resolution that called for the creation of a framework for a global fund on Alzheimer's. We talked to the chairwoman and the ranking member. Adding this language will have USAID consult with the committee about how we might create a framework under which the world could work together to deal with the epidemic of Alzheimer's. It obviously is having a crippling effect here in our own country and among millions of our families, but worldwide it is a devastating disease and threatens many of the world's economies. And so this is a major step forward, and I want to thank, with a great deal of gratitude, the chairwoman and the ranking member for including my language in this regard. Thank you.
Ms. Lee?
Thank you. I, too, want to thank our chair and our ranking member for their very hard work on this bill. Also, for your staff. I know how hard the staff has worked on this bill, so thank you so much. Want to also thank you for including two requests of mine in this manager's amendment. The first, I want to explain that it clarifies that the State Department, under the Bureau of International Organization Affairs, has the authority to make a one-time contribution to the construction and dedication of the memorial in honor of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. This important memorial will give the world an opportunity to acknowledge the tragedy and to consider the legacy of the most tragic period of human history, which continues to have a profound impact on people of African descent today, millions of whom are African Americans. The United States is really only one of a handful of countries that has not made a financial contribution. So it's my hope that the State Department will heed this committee's call to support this symbol of struggle and triumph without further delay. And second, I want to thank our chair again for including important language that condemns Boko Haram for its violent attacks on civilians in Nigeria. It's been more than 2 months since 300 schoolgirls were kidnapped by this terrorist organization. Tragically, 200 are still missing. The language also encourages the State Department and USAID to continue their support for initiatives that promote the human rights of women and girls in Nigeria and around the world. Many of my colleagues and I have been calling for the immediate establishment of a Nigerian relief fund for the victims and families of Boko Haram and the violence that has been perpetrated. And we encourage the State Department and USAID just to look at ways that they can help these families so that they can be supported through this very, very desperate and traumatic period. The world has a moral imperative to ensure that these girls are returned safely and that every child has an absolute right, and we reaffirm that, to receive an education in a safe and protective environment. With regard to Iraq, this bill contains $283 million for international security assistance. I'm pleased to see the strong reporting requirement, which instructs the State Department in consultation with the Defense Department to send Congress a detailed plan on how these funds are obligated. All of us are concerned about the horrific sectarian violence taking place in Iraq, but we also must realize, many of us do, that there's no military solution in Iraq, and President Obama himself has said that. The future of Iraq is in the hands of the Iraqi people. Our job is to continue to promote regional and international engagement, recognition of human rights, and political reforms. And so I thank you again, Madam Chair, and our ranking member for making sure this reporting requirement is in this bill. Thank you.
Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for the good work, and especially on that language on the Mexican embassy. As you know, that was a little bit overcost, and thank you for that oversight. But I want to thank you, and I want to thank the ranking woman for all the good work that she and the chairwoman and the ranking woman have been working, and especially the staff. I know that on Father's Day about 7:30, the staff was working very hard, and I appreciate the staff for Ms. Granger, and of course Ms. Laurie. Let me just mention I'm very, very happy on the work that y'all have done on Central America and Mexico. And as you know, the administration, and it's my words, short-sighted when they had proposed to cut the money for Mexico, Central America, Colombia, and the Caribbean basin, especially with all the issues that we're facing. So I want to thank you for the money, for restoring that money back. In particular, the support for the counter-narcotics and law enforcement, and also programs to promote economic trade, as well as the assistance for the rule and law for judicial reform, and especially for the smuggling aspect of it. As you know, the kids are coming in. There's a lot of work, and I've always said either we do the work on the first yard line, which is on the U.S.-Mexico work, or we take it a little bit further. And I know the work on the southern border with Mexico is something that I want to thank you all for doing itself. Members, let me just conclude with this, and let me tell you what this is, the smuggling and the trafficking work is so important, what we need to focus on that, and this is what this bill and this amendment does. Let me just give you one example. May of this year, just last month in Texas, from El Paso down to Brownsville, there were 48,000 individuals that Border Patrol caught. 9,700 of them were kids. If you get 48,000 and get the average of $5,000, and the smuggling fees go from $4,000 to $6,000, maybe a little bit more, but let's the average of 5,000. If you get 48,000 individuals that they caught times 5,000, that's $240 million profit that the smuggling drug organizations made for 1 month. $240 million for 1 month's work, which doesn't include the drugs. This is why the work that you, Madam Chair, and the ranking member and the rest of the staff is doing so good. So I want to say thank you so much for the great work that y'all did on Mexico and Central America. Thank you so much.
Mr. Honda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to express my concern with the escalating situation in Iraq. We know that the current humanitarian security crisis in Iraq is deeply rooted in sectarian tensions. After nearly 10 years in Iraq, the American people are war-weary, and rightly so. In bipartisan consensus, 74% of Americans do not support sending combat troops to help deal with the Iraq crisis. Last week, I was proud to support Congresswoman Lee's amendment to not allow defense-appropriated funding for combat operation on the ground. That amendment would not have impacted the President's ability to protect our embassies or citizens, nor would it have prevented the President's ability were there a direct and imminent attack upon our national security. With that, I want to thank Chairwoman Granger and Ranking Member Lowy's prioritization for embassy security for more than 275 facilities overseas. The situation in Iraq needs political reconciliation, regional cooperation and development initiatives that are inclusive and nonviolent. We must pull back from our military force focus and address structural sectarian tensions. We have a choice to avoid repeating the same mistakes of the past, and I want to thank you again.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz. One or two. There being no further discussion, the gentlelady is recognized to close.
I urge members to support this amendment.
On the manager's amendment, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Ms. Lowy.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to offer an amendment.
Clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mrs.
Add
Lowy,
unanimous
page...
consent
Without
to
objection,
waive
the reading is
reading.
dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, the underlying bill does not include basic health care equity to female Peace Corps volunteers. This inequity has come to light because Peace Corps volunteers are the last group of women serving our country overseas not covered by the Hyde Amendment. This is not an issue about expansion of choice or abortion. My amendment does not touch the prohibition on program funds. It just ensures all the young women of the Peace Corps have the same health coverage as every other woman working for the federal government. Peace Corps staff, as all U.S. government employees, are afforded certain rights and protections in the case of rape, incest, and endangerment of life of the mother. In the 2012 NDAA, Congress, on a bipartisan basis, extended these protections to service women. Peace Corps volunteers are now the last group without these protections, requiring the technical fix in this amendment. It is the right thing to do. It is long overdue. I urge you to join me and support this amendment.
Mr. Honda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to support Ranking Member Lowy's amendment. As a returned Peace Corps volunteer in El Salvador, I commend her leadership in fighting for each of our volunteers who answer the call to service. My own Peace Corps service in El Salvador was transformational. It showed me the resilience of a community in the face of real poverty. It taught me the enduring camaraderie with my fellow volunteers, and it taught me independence and self-worth. Ask any volunteer, we all agree that in the end, we took more than we give. And yet, for the sacrifice for our citizens who represent the best and strongest of our diplomacy, we denied them abortion services, even in cases of life endangerment, rape, or incest. We must act to add basic exceptions for instances of rape, incest, and life endangerment. These volunteers serve as ambassadors in their respective villages and communities. When they need the most care, no woman should be left with a medical bill. Women serving our country should never have to face the tragedy of a sexual assault, but if they do, they should, at the minimum, be able to receive care and support without having to use their own meager funds to pay for services. With that, I am proud to be an original co-sponsor of Ranking Member Lowy's Peace Corps Equity Act of 2014.
There being no further discussion, the gentlelady is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. More than 60% of the 7,000 current Peace Corps volunteers are women. These women are serving as ambassadors of the United States, working in every corner of the world, saving and changing lives. Peace Corps volunteers are now the last group not afforded certain rights and protection in the case of rape, incest, and endangerment in the life of the mother. My amendment just makes a technical fix, adds these protections, much like the 2012 NDAA extended these protections to serve at women. It is not an expansion of choice or abortion. It does not change the longstanding prohibition on program funds. It just ensures all the young women of the Peace Corps have the same health coverage as every other woman working for the federal government. My colleagues on the other side have supported this exception in a number of cases. They were, after all, included in the Hyde Amendment. I'm just asking that it be applied fairly and equitably to all women represented in the United States who, by virtue of living and working abroad, face risks to their safety and security. This is the right thing to do. I urge you to join me and support this amendment.
Questions on the Lowy amendment? All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed. Chairman Wolf.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr. Wolf. At the end of the bill, before the spending reduction
Without
account.
objection, the reading is dispensed with.
We had a hearing, and Nathan Sharansky, who was a hero, who was in Perm Camp 35, came up with the idea of naming a road in front of the Chinese embassy for Xiaobo. Xiaobo was a Nobel Prize winner of 2010. He's in prison. He was at Tiananmen Square. And this was the same thing that the Congress did with Sakharov back in the 80s. The Washington Post has done an editorial in support of it. The human rights groups have done. The D.C. City Council supports it. It is supported in the House by Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, Congressman Steny Hoyer, Congressman Elijah Cummings, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Layton. In the Senate, Congressman Chris in the House, Smith. In the Senate, Ted Cruz, John McCain, John Thune, Pat Toomey. It is literally a way of sending a message on Tiananmen. Now, President Reagan said that the words in the Declaration of Independence were basically a covenant not only with the people in Philadelphia in 1776, but a covenant with the entire world. It was a covenant with Xiaobo. There are Catholic bishops in jail today. The outcome of this amendment makes a difference. There are Protestant pastors in jail today. The outcome of this amendment makes a difference. There are Buddhist monks and nuns, 130 have killed themselves in Tibet that are in jail today. I asked to send a message with regard to this. The only one I know who could, outside this body, who would be opposed to this would be the Chinese government. On behalf of Xiaobo, whose wife is under house arrest, we cannot even get to see her. He was not able to go. I asked for support for this amendment, which would name the street in front of the Chinese embassy on behalf of Xiaobo, who won the 2000 Nobel Prize, the same thing that we did for Sakharov, and the idea was not mine. The idea was Nathan Sharansky. I asked for an aye vote. And yield back.
Ms. Loy.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of Mr. Wolf's amendment. The Chinese are eager to be seen as a first world country, yet their human rights record leaves much to be desired. You are referencing a human rights activist that has been respected, that has been in a Chinese prison since 2009 for speaking out against the one-party communist system in China and their human rights abuses. My friend's amendment would ensure there is a daily reminder to the Chinese representative here that the United States puts the plight of human rights activists at the forefront of our relationships, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Ms. Granger.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in reluctant opposition to the gentleman's amendment. I know the gentleman has deep and long-standing concerns over China's poor human rights record. Many of us do. I just don't believe that naming the street in front of the Chinese embassy in the United States is the way to advance the right of the Chinese people. I'm concerned about the repercussions against our government if we name this street, and unfortunately I cannot support the gentleman's amendment.
Mr. Fattah.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment. And, there were some outrageous actions taken by the Egyptian government yesterday to imprison a number of journalists. The idea that anyone would be in jail for speaking out for such a long period of time by any government in the world, and particularly a government with such an important nation as China, I think that for us to speak out on this in this way sends an important symbolic statement that we reject this out of hand. And I think it also reminds our own government that we have a responsibility to also operate within a framework of laws that are acceptable and make common sense. Thank you.
Mr. Honda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a very interesting amendment, and speaking to the impact, a lot of people who are Asian descent do not like public embarrassment, and this may serve as a function of that. It may not have to be permanent in terms of changing the name of the street. Perhaps we shouldn't be telling D.C. to change the name of streets, but I think that this amendment is worthwhile to argue about and debate, and I personally would support this. Thank you.
Ms. McCollum.
Mr. Chair, as a former city council member, and if this amendment was directing the city of St. Paul from Congress to change the name of a street, I wouldn't vote for it. I appreciate what the gentleman's doing, but I feel I need to be consistent about local control. So
If the gentleman would yield.
The gentleman is, if he would yield. Would you yield?
The D.C. government, I went down and met with the D.C. government. I went down and met with Councilman Mendelson. They support this and are passing a resolution, and Eleanor Holmes Norton. I would not have done it either, and I agree with the gentleman.
And so I wanted that on the record for the gentleman, that there's been consultation and that the city of municipality of Washington, D.C. supports the amendment. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Let me echo what the chairwoman has said. I rise in reluctant opposition to this. You invite retaliation, and you're sort of poking the finger in the eye. I surrender to no one in my opposition to China. However, I think this is a bit premature, and needlessly, I think, invites an escalation of our government-to-government relationships with China. I recognize Chairman Wolf's emotional attachment to this issue and his vigorous promotion of it. But I will be voting no. Is there further discussion? Chairman Wolf.
We're going to go home next week for 4th of July. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. As you think about this, it's a big oral issue that's going to be out there for a long time. How would Ronald Reagan vote if he could be here today? How would Lech Walesa vote if he could be here today? How would Václav Havel vote if he could be here today? How would Martin Luther King, who did the unbelievable letter from the Birmingham jail, the letter that everyone should read, how would he vote if he were here today? How would Nelson Mandela vote if he were here today? How would Pope John Paul vote if he were here today? I ask you, the message that this will send for those who are behind prison is powerful. I ask you, beg you, for an aye vote, and yield back the balance of my time.
Question is on the Wolf Amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. No. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there other amendments? Mr. Schiff. Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Schiff. Page 35, line 8, increase the dollar amount by $255 million. Page 46, line 14, increase the first dollar amount by $5 million. Page 47, line 4.
Request that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at the outset, I want to compliment Chairwoman Granger and Ranking Member Lowy for an extraordinary bill. It represents a tremendous amount of hard work and, as always, a real quality work product, which shows the leadership and integrity of our subcommittee. I'm very grateful for all your work, Madam Chair. Last year, during consideration of this bill, I offered an amendment to address the overthrow of a disastrous but elected president of Egypt and his replacement by a transitional government installed by the Egyptian military. Although I withdrew the amendment, I shared with the committee my deep concern that the administration's decision to ignore statutory language on the coup was incompatible with our commitment to the rule of law and was shaped by and would also perpetuate two corrosive beliefs about America's Middle East policy. The first, which is held by many in the Middle East, is that the American commitment to democracy and the rule of law does not include them. The second, which has received wisdom among many here in Washington, is that the United States can pursue democracy in the Arab world or elsewhere, and it can pursue stability, but not both, and certainly not at the same time. Now, a year later, the man who engineered that coup has been elected president of Egypt with 96.91% of the vote. The man he deposed sits in prison along with thousands of others. Death sentences have been handed out to hundreds of people en masse based on the flimsiest or completely non-existent evidence in show trials. Young, liberal, secular Egyptians, the people who led the ouster of Mubarak in the first place, and who are the country's best hope for the future, have been crushed and wither in prison. Congress has sought to nudge Egypt back towards a democratic path by withholding portions of aid and conditioning it, but Egypt's failure to make progress is so obvious that a new approach is necessary. President Bush, in his second inaugural address, devoted almost the entire address to the promotion of democracy. President Bush was not wrong. That is very consistent with the ideals of this country. And although many of us take issue with how he tried to accomplish the promotion of democracy, America as a beacon of democracy is inherently consistent with our history and our values. President Obama has similarly championed the idea and the promotion of democracy. But I think similarly in the case of Egypt, the administration policy falls short. One need look at the Secretary of State's recent expression of confidence this weekend in Cairo that the full aid package, American aid, would soon be restored, when just 2 days before an Egyptian court confirmed death sentences for 183 people accused of a 2013 attack on a police station. And yesterday, another court convicted 3 journalists and sentenced them to lengthy prison terms. Today, a foremost leader of the secular youth movement, which we celebrated 2 years ago, sits incarcerated and abandoned. The dialogue with Egypt is essentially this. We go to Egypt, we make the case for progress along the democratic path, and the response we get from Egypt can be crystallized in this way. We thank you very much for your input, but if it's all the same to you, just leave the taxpayer check on the desk and don't let the door hit you in the backside on the way out. I propose that America begin a new chapter with Egypt, one that is directed less at the ossified military or corrupt politicians and more on the people of Egypt, especially the millions of young Egyptians who yearn for a better future. We need to bet on them, that they can build a democratic Egypt, not overnight, but nonetheless one that accounts for and represents all Egyptians. And we can also help Egypt to confront the threat from radicals, particularly in the underdeveloped Sinai Peninsula that shares a long border with Israel. My amendment restructures our assistance to Egypt to do just that, and it saves $130 million that we can use to meet other needs. Let me just underscore that for my budget-conscious colleagues. This will save U.S. taxpayers $130 million. First, the amendment cuts $390 million, or 30%, from our military assistance to Egypt and directs that the remainder of the military assistance be focused on counterterrorism efforts. The amendment also increases IMET funding, our training of their military officers, by $5 million to build military-to-military ties that will be crucial in coming years to expose a new generation of Egyptian officers to our system and our values. Second, economic assistance more than doubles from $200 million to $455 million, with a large increase in our investment in educating the young from $35 to $60 million and a doubling of scholarship money from $10 to $20 million for poor Egyptians. Recent press reports have speculated that ISIS may be eyeing the Sinai as a potential target, and there is evidence of growing ISIS influence there. Sinai is deeply impoverished, and its people have long felt abused and neglected by Cairo. This amendment also directs $30 million in ESF go to programs in Sinai to try to give its people a greater sense of hope and an alternative to fundamentalism. The conviction of journalists in Egypt is the latest in a long line of incidents targeting journalists and press freedom. Trends in Egypt are moving in the wrong direction. Egypt's transition will require an active, lively, and responsible press, and my amendment directs that $10 million go to support independent media in Egypt. So under my amendment, the overall Egypt aid package will shrink by $130 million. I'm winding up, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence. But it'll be now more heavily weighted in areas where it's needed. But even, I want to underscore this, even after this cut, Egypt will still receive $910 million in military assistance. So even under this modest reduction, Egypt will still receive about $1 billion in military assistance. I don't want anyone having the impression that we are cutting all military aid for Egypt. Mr. Chairman, I believe Egypt is backsliding towards a reprise of the Mubarak era. For good or ill, Egypt carries with it the hopes of a democratic future. For much of the Arab world, tiny Tunisia cannot do it alone. This is just simply too important to be abandoned in the interest of expediency. The U.S. must continue to promote democracy even when it's hard, and even when that means speaking frankly or critically with our allies. The amendment I offer today is consistent with what Mr. Wolf just expressed and Mr. Fattah. It's consistent with our democratic ideals and our national security interests, and will tell the people of Egypt that we are with them and not just the generals. And I yield back.
Chairman Granger.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. The bill conditions aid to Egypt based on upholding the peace treaty with Israel, continued cooperation with the United States, and progress on their democratic transition. There is no waiver for the Secretary of State, even though the administration asked for one. And this is the most important. Maintaining the United States-Egypt relationship is a national security priority. The aid we provide to the military is also vital for Israel's security. I urge a no vote on the amendment.
Ms. Louie.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in reluctant opposition to this amendment. Egypt has long been an important ally. Its stability is essential for regional and global security. The Egyptian government has long been a partner in promoting peace and security with Israel. Egypt continues to uphold the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty, which is a linchpin of regional stability. Egypt is in the middle of a tremendously sensitive and critical moment in its transition. The current situation is extremely troubling, and I agree and I understand the position of my good friend. I appreciate what he is trying to do. But we have an interest in doing all that we can to maximize Egypt's ability to come through this phase successfully, to position ourselves strategically to build a relationship with the new government. Egypt remains a close partner of the United States on shared security interests. The Egyptian government continues to make significant contributions to counterterrorism and efforts to combat arms smuggling in the Sinai and elsewhere. Egypt facilitates U.S. overflights and the transit of U.S. naval vessels throughout the Suez Canal, supporting our force posture across the region. FMF enables Egypt to maintain its military readiness and interoperability with U.S. forces. Yet, I must caution that the prosecution of journalists defies basic standards of human rights, is part of a disturbing pattern targeting democratic activists and others working to make government transparent and accountable. I do believe that Egypt must be a partner for peace, serve as a positive example for the region, which is why I believe that the conditions included in the chairwoman's bill are the most prudent path that Congress can take. But make no mistake, these convictions should be reversed immediately. And I do want to say to my good friend, this is one of the most difficult issues that the chair and I have had to deal with in this bill. I've reached out to people like Ann Patterson, the former ambassador, who is, in my judgment, one of the wisest, most committed person that I know in this region of the world. And her advice reluctantly is all the same: stay the course for now. So while my colleague has made some very good points, I respect your view, I respect this amendment, and I hope that in the coming weeks, as this bill moves through the process, we can continue to have this conversation, because it is with great regret that I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. But I do thank you for bringing up the thoughts you have. Your presentation was cogent, and I look forward to working with you throughout the process. But again, I reluctantly urge a no vote. Thank you.
Mr. Price?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment. I believe this committee has debated aid to Egypt every year, at least as long as I can remember. This has always been a vexing issue. We've usually considered the critical nature of the relationship with Egypt, the strategic importance of Egypt in the region. We've almost always decried human rights violations in Egypt, democratic violations, and agonized over how aid can be used, most effectively be used as leverage in trying to support human rights and democracy while also supporting an important strategic relationship. Now, I've almost always supported this aid to Egypt, have understood the importance of it. But I expect a lot of you can remember the Egyptian military brass parading into our offices each year and talking to us about the critical nature of this aid. And I think my conversation with them has often amounted to expressing some understanding and appreciation for the alliance, but also saying you certainly do make it hard for your friends. You make it very, very hard for your friends to be supportive when these egregious human rights violations recur and recur and recur. The jailing of journalists, the jailing of opposition politicians, the harassment and jailing now of NGO leaders and employees. Many of you remember the case of Saeed Abraham, a renowned social scientist. Just inexplicable harassment, imprisonment of this man over many years. I remember talking with President Mubarak about that personally, getting absolutely nowhere. Now we're facing a situation in which aid is no less important to us than during the Mubarak years. But the practices of the government in some ways are even worse than during the Mubarak years. I can't remember hundreds of people, hundreds of protesters being given death sentences in the Mubarak years. And now this episode with Al Jazeera English is the most recent example. Long sentences for these journalists who were simply doing their job. Egypt, unfortunately, seems a long, long way from the promise of the Arab Spring. The Muslim Brotherhood failed the test of governing. They failed the test of governing inclusively and legitimately. And there's been a strong backlash, of course, with now military control. And the military government is failing. I'd say miserably failing the test of democracy. Mr. Schiff's amendment is I think, well conceived. It makes an appropriate, somewhat modest reallocation of funds, but it also sends an important message. I just feel compelled to send the message, and I think we have an opportunity to do that here today. We understand, we appreciate Egypt's critical regional role. We appreciate the friendship with this country. We want to be supportive. But our country simply cannot and will not be indifferent to gross violations of human rights and democratic values. So I urge adoption of the Schiff Amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a new chapter with Egypt, and largely we've brought it upon ourselves, unfortunately. They have been a long-time ally, and nature abhors a vacuum. For every step we take back from Egypt, the Russians are more than willing to take a step forward. For the first time since 1974, the Russians have been interacting with the Egyptian military, and that should be very disturbing to us. And let me say, we've been, for better or for worse, and I think it's been for better, we've been Egypt's primary supplier of defense items since the 1970s. And why? To the benefit of our relationship with Egypt and our special relationship with the State of Israel, and I think to the betterment of the safety of our own country, the United States. Thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of Congressman Schiff's amendment and want to thank him for this. I remember last year and you mentioned the history of this amendment, and so thank you for bringing this forward this year, because I think now is the time to move on this. I have consistently and historically supported aid to Egypt. However, oftentimes we talk about conditioning our aid on religious freedoms, human rights, democratic reforms. But I think from what I have learned over the years is we condition this aid when we want to. And it depends on what part of the world and what is taking place that these conditions apply. What I'm extremely concerned about now with regard to Egypt is what message is this sending to the rest of the world? Do we care about human rights? Do we care about the jailing of journalists? Do we care about democratic reforms? Or do we not care about these? We have to be clear at some point. And what has taken place in Egypt, while again, I have visited Egypt, I know Egypt, I have supported historically the aid to Egypt for many, many reasons, but as a member of this body and as a United States citizen, at some point, we have to put our money where our mouth is. I think this is a very moderate and modest amendment, as Mr. Price said, but I think it's about time that this committee sends a strong, clear message, not only to Egypt, but to the rest of the world, that we really do care about democracy and democratic reforms and the jailing of journalists and human rights and religious freedoms. We really do care about that. And I think that this amendment really sends that message that we really do care. Thank you, Mr. Schiff.
Mr. Dent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, rise in opposition. I'll be supporting Mr. Schiff on one of his future amendments here today, but on this one, I think we have to be very, very careful. The Egyptian government and the military is unwilling to reconcile with the Muslim Brotherhood. To the extent that the United States continues to equivocate on this Egyptian aid, I believe undermines our interests, and as Mr. Frelinghuysen indicated, will further invite the Russians back in a la pre-1974. Russia respects its treaty with Israel. They're helping us in making sure that Hamas does not receive the weapons they had previously received under the Muslim Brotherhood government. I cannot defend some of the actions recently of the Egyptian government, but we have to think about what the alternatives are. And the alternatives are, frankly, the Muslim Brotherhood. And that is simply unacceptable. This administration, when the Arab Spring began in Egypt, it took them all of 2 weeks to throw Hosni Mubarak under the bus. Whatever Mubarak's faults, he was a 30-year friend of the United States. Turning our back on Mubarak the way we did sent a terrible signal throughout the Middle East to Saudi Arabia and others that America is not going to stand by its friends. Now again, I cannot defend some of the recent actions of the Egyptian government, but we must think about the alternatives right now. And I fear that this government at some point could be replaced again by a radical regime. The Egyptian government today is protecting the Copts in Egypt. That was not the case prior to the change in government of the coup. I hear regularly from Coptic Christians who tell me regularly about the abuses that they've faced, the persecution, the killings, the burning of the churches. Egypt will return to that. We have to, I think, work very carefully with the government in Egypt. But I do think this amendment, maybe well-intentioned, will take the United States in the wrong direction with respect to Egypt and lessen our ability to influence events in that country. So I would ask for a no vote.
Gentleman from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also rise in opposition to the amendment. And I agree with what the ranking member said. This is a tremendously sensitive time in the transition of Egypt. In 1979, I entered the Sinai Desert. It was the year that the Egyptian-Israeli peace accords had been signed. And the first thing I saw on a twisted pile of concrete and rubble, which is all too familiar a sight now in the Middle East, on that pile was a handwritten sign, and it said, "Here was the war, here is the peace." Now that peace has held for a very long time in the middle of a very difficult neighborhood where there is instability and conflict all around. It's an imperfect peace, it's a cold peace, but nonetheless it is held. At this point, I think trying to continue to live up to our treaty obligations in helping the Egyptians stabilize their country, while also trying to push them in a new direction on human rights and the reform of governing structures to bring about a more proper rule of law, is the appropriate balance to strike. Without this aid, what potentially happens? Do their governing structures potentially collapse? Do things get worse in the Sinai? Do we push them into the arms of other countries who would be all too willing potentially to supply them? What does that do then to our prospects for the development of human rights? So I respectfully oppose the gentleman's amendment.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also rise in opposition, and I will tell you an amendment of one of the people that I most admire here, who are always standing up for human rights. But I will tell you that Egypt is highly imperfect. It is a highly imperfect, struggling democracy, which is why our subcommittee, this subcommittee, has had multiple meetings, including classified briefings on Egypt, to make sure that we are doing the right thing. I just want to clarify a couple things. The language in the bill does have strong limitations, very strong limitations. I think the strongest that we've had, at least since I've been around. No waivers are allowed in this language, precisely because we agree with all of the concerns that have been stated here today. But let's just also keep some other things in mind. It's a struggling, young, struggling, problematic, but struggling democracy. Number two, look at what's going on to their south in Sudan, where there's basically a civil war going on. Look at what's going on in Libya, in Syria. Do I need to remind you what's going on in Iraq right now? Do I have to remind you that this new struggling government in Egypt has closed down over 1,000 tunnels that were being used to funnel arms to the enemies of Israel and the enemies of the United States? And yes, we're all concerned about the issues that were brought up today. To Mr. Dent's point, I would imagine that these were the discussions. Obviously, I was a very young kid. These were the discussions, the very difficult discussions at the time in Iran, when we had then not a struggling democratic friend in the Shah of Iran, but frankly a dictatorship, which is not what we're dealing with here. And I don't know what language there were in those appropriations bills, because this got very tough language on making sure that we condition aid, which I highly, I'm so grateful to the chairwoman, to the ranking member. So let's just be very careful that we do not make the same mistakes when we wished that the world was, how we wished it was going to be, not what it really was. And we, in essence, replaced the Shah of Iran, dictator, not a democracy as we have, a struggling democracy as we have in Egypt, with the Ayatollah Khomeini, and that's a decision that the world has lived to regret now for over a generation. So I commend Mr. Schiff for highlighting the concerns, the issues. We all have them. Nobody here, at least I can tell you that nobody here who's voting against your amendment is because we don't agree that there are serious concerns. But the language is very strong in the bill. There are no waiver requirements in that very strong language. And I believe that this would be a very dangerous thing to do at this time with that struggling democracy. So because of those issues, I have to also ask for a no vote. Thank you.
There being no further discussion, the gentleman's recognized to close.
I thank the chairman, and I thank my colleagues for sharing their thoughts on this issue. The more I reflect on it, the more I think, though, that the more things change, the more they stay the same. This was precisely the discussion we had during the decades of the Mubarak regime, when we urged Mubarak to reform, and he ignored us, when we effectively gave Mubarak a blank check. And yes, when the chickens came home to roost, after decades of urging Mubarak to release the secular opposition, don't make the Muslim Brotherhood the only viable opposition, yes, we were not willing to bail out this dictator who had ignored our every urging. And I fear we're on the same path now. If we write a blank check and continue to write a blank check to Egypt, they will continue cashing that check. And all we will earn is what we have earned in the past in Egypt, and that is the enmity of the Egyptian people. Mr. Wolf's amendment earlier asked us in a very forthright fashion, what do we stand for? And what would these people who we admire do? Well, I would ask the same question. What would Nelson Mandela say about the jailing of journalists? And what would these other heroes like Lech Walesa say about unrestricted aid to those that are suppressing even secular opposition? I would add another name to the list. What would Tom Lantos, no greater champion of the State of Israel, have to say? He championed the relationship with Egypt, but he too called Egypt to task over aid when Egypt was not living up to its responsibilities. And at a certain point, we have to ask ourselves, what do we stand for? Are we saying that it's too dangerous to support democracy, or we'll only support democracy when it is convenient or poses no risk to the United States? That has never been consistent with our history or ideals, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Question is on the Schiff amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not.
On that, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. Is there sufficient support? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amade? No. Mr. Amade, no. Mr. Bishop? Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? No. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? No. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson? No. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent? No. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? No. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Aye. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Aye. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? No. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? No. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? No. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera Butler? Ms. Herrera Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Aye. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? No. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter?
Very reluctantly no.
Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Latham? No. Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee? Aye. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum? Aye. Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? Mr. Owens? No. Mr. Owens, no. Mr. Pastor? Ms. Pingree? Aye. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? No. Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby? No. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? No. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roby-Allard? Aye. Ms. Roby-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Schiff? Aye. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Simpson? No. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? No. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? No. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visclosky? No. Mr. Visclosky, no. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? No. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, no. Mr. Wolf? No. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? No. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? No. Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded or change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 11, the nays are 35. The amendment is not agreed to. Ms. Capter?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Ms. Capter. On page 35 of the committee report, insert immediately before Capital Investment Fund the following: Ukraine. The committee encourages U.S.
That the amendment be
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, this amendment would encourage USAID to partner with the National Guard State Partnership Program to provide and deliver humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, with particular emphasis on agricultural assistance to rural women. In your stack of amendments, you have an article that was recently in the New York Times. While I'm discussing my amendment, I would encourage you to just look at the photo. This is the object of my affection, trying to reach and give assistance to those that are literally holding Ukraine together. It is an understatement to say this is a moment when liberty hangs in the balance for millions of people in that former Soviet republic. It is a time of transition. As co-chair of the Ukrainian caucus and someone who's been engaged in Ukraine for 43 years of my life, I can tell you this is really important. While in the capitals of Kyiv and Brussels and Warsaw and Moscow, Ukraine's future is being shaped. Let me share with you some vital facts about the daily reality of life in Ukraine. That country could be the greatest nation in Europe. It will be the breadbasket of the world if she can transition to a more democratic governance. Nearly half the food being produced inside that country today is being produced by the women that look like the babusha in this photo. Nobody writes about them, nobody talks about them, they are hidden to the world, but as the story says, a dirt road, the woman in the photo is Maria, and a dirt road leads to her town with potholes so deep the drivers zigzag past each other. There are horse-drawn carts, roosters crowing, elderly women in kerchiefs, and a church in the distance painted green, topped by bulbous spires. If you look at what she's holding, it isn't a cane, it's something called a scythe. You cut hay with that. And these subsistence living women, many of whom have been widowed, with men not there, hold these villages and literally the sustenance of Ukraine together. They are now producing well over 60% of the vegetables eaten in the country. And let me give you another statistic. The leading cause of death in Ukraine today is alcoholism. The leading cause of death. Nearly half the deaths annually in the country, largely among men. It is a country that merely survives. These women are the foundation stones of the future. I will end with this story. A couple weeks ago, I had the great privilege of accompanying a delegation led by our Vice President, Joe Biden, to Ukraine for the swearing-in of the new president. And we walked through the cobblestone streets of the capital, headed to the parliament, called the Rada. And there were a lot of leaders there from a number of countries, and we all turned a corner and going up these very ancient streets, and President of Germany and Ambassador from Serbia, and various nations were walking, parading to the parliament. When our delegation from the United States turned the corner and began walking up the street, resounding cheers started to happen at a level I have never heard, where the people, thousands of Ukrainians, were assembled along the sides of the street shouting, America, 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 louder and louder and louder, and just bounced off these ancient buildings left over from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I doubt that in many other places we've talked about today, a delegation from the United States would have been cheered like that. I ask the consideration of this committee today in doing what is necessary. They don't want to hand out, but we really do need to give a helping hand at this moment in order to keep the people fed as the price of their currency drops, as IMF strictures lock in, and these next 2 or 3 years become critical in transitioning to a country that so much wants to be a part of our democratic heritage globally. So I ask for your support of the Captor Amendment directed toward these women who are holding that country together. And I believe democracy depends on their survival.
Chairman Granger.
Mr. Chairman, I'm willing to accept this amendment.
All in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
All right, I was just going to agree. I have no objection, assuming USA can partner with the National Guard. No problem.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The
Thank
ayes
you.
have it. The amendment's agreed to.
Thank you.
Ms. Lee.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. This is Lee number 1.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. Lee. Page 12, beginning on line 18, strike $1,765,519,000.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment would increase the level of base funding for the contributions for the International Peacekeeping Activities Account, also known as SIPA, to $2.5 billion. It would also lift the 25% cap on U.S. contributions to the United Nations peacekeeping operations, allowing us to pay our peacekeeping dues at the full assessed rate of 28.36%. I appreciate all of the work that our chair and ranking member have been able to do to rally support for peacekeeping activities in this bill. The fact of the matter is, however, United Nations peacekeeping missions are currently facing a number of critical and challenging demands, and it's therefore essential that they receive full funding through this account. That's why it's also essential that this committee oppose the peacekeeping cap included in this bill and ensure that flexibility is provided so that credits from previously appropriated funds for peacekeeping activities may be used to pay for current bills. By adding new restrictions and keeping the cap, we could weaken ongoing peacekeeping operations in places that really are critical to America's national security, including Mali, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It also would put our nation back into arrears at the United Nations if we don't do this, jeopardizes relations with our important allies who put their troops in harm's way to serve in missions that the United States supports on the Security Council. Now, as one of 2 congressional representatives to the United Nations this year, I can tell you that this has been significant pressure on the United Nations peacekeeping budget over the last year, and I hear this over and over again. With new peacekeeping missions authorized now, there are new ones in Mali and the Central African Republic, and interethnic violence in South Sudan. The United States needs to continue to play a central role in the expansion of United Nations peacekeeping activities on the African continent. We do get a huge bang for our buck with this. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you, and I yield.
Chairman Granger.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. This bill currently funds U.S. contributions to UN peacekeeping missions at last year's level, even though the subcommittee's overall allocation was reduced from last year by more than $700 million. The amendment would lead us to exceed our allocation. The amendment also would allow our contribution to the UN peacekeeping missions to exceed the statutory cap of 25%. This means that there would be no limit on the share the U.S. could be asked to pay. I oppose the amendment.
Ms. Louie.
Mr. Chairman, although the chairwoman and I agree on most things, I rise in strong support of this amendment offered by my colleague, Ms. Lee. The amendment recognizes the critical role the UN peacekeepers play in hotspots around the world, as well as the economic benefits from burden sharing with other nations that are achieved through UN peacekeeping. The FY 2015 SIPA payment is critical to missions in the USA national interests like Mali and Somalia. UN peacekeeping complements U.S. national security and foreign policy objectives. It's a bargain for American taxpayers. According to a study by the Government Accountability Office, deploying UN peacekeepers is 8 times less expensive than fielding a comparable U.S.-led force. In addition to increased funding, the amendment would also lift the 25% cap on U.S. contributions to UN peacekeeping activities, which was first instituted by Congress in 1994. UN peacekeeping dues are actually renegotiated every 3 years, a process in which the U.S. actively participates and the U.S. votes in the Security Council. Contrary to this mark, provisions lifting the cap have been regularly supported by both Democratic and Republican administrations, and with very rare exceptions have been included in appropriation bills with bipartisan support. This amendment also strikes language limiting the use of credits the U.S. receives from changes in peacekeeping missions or from paying its bills early. These credits would help us stretch our peacekeeping dollars further, and limiting their use only exacerbates our arrears. Yield back.
Mr. Farr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of this amendment, and I think we have to realize that, you know, there's always a lot of criticism in this Congress through the years about UN and whether we ought to even have it and be involved and pay our dues and so on. Frankly, if it didn't exist, we'd be arguing about how to create it right now. In this troubled world, we need the United Nations. I'm really proud of the United Nations. It was created in San Francisco in I think it was 57? 47. And I'm so proud of it that I'm probably one of the few members of Congress that's part of the UN Association. As a United Nations Association, I pay my dues to it, and I fly the UN flag outside my Santa Cruz office. I think if anything, what our country stands for is a peaceful world. The United States seems to, I think we kind of lose that image sometimes when we're just sort of going to war country. Thomas Jefferson said, "Peace and friendship with all mankind is our wisest policy, and I wish we may be permitted to pursue it." Yeah, if you want to pursue peace, you got to invest in it. This is the best bang for our buck, the investment in UN peacekeeping forces. This is the tool of peace that we can invest in without putting our own men and women in harm's way. So I would strongly support this amendment. I can't imagine that we'd want to do anything but have a very strong UN peacekeeping forces.
There being no further discussion, the gentlelady is recognized to close.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the ranking member and Mr. Farr for your comments and emphasizing the fact that we must all recognize that the United States dues payment to the United Nations peacekeeping operations really represents a very small investment of taxpayer dollars. These funds are critical to advancing the United States' national interests, and they're very cost effective. According to a recent study by the GAO, United Nations peacekeeping is 8 times less expensive than deploying a United States-led force. This amendment would ensure more robust funding for UN peacekeeping, something 2/3, quite frankly, of the voters strongly favor. So I ask for an aye vote. Thank you.
Question is on the Lee amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Would ask to waive.
Amendment offered by Mr. Quigley.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I'm a dance partner with Ms. Lee today and tomorrow on similar amendments. Let me bring this to a specific country, the issue that she was just talking about, the devastating sectarian violence happening right now in the Central African Republic. The fighting between Muslims and Christians in CAR is escalating dangerously, and senior UN officials believe the situation there could soon devolve into outright genocide. Over 500,000 people have fled their homes to escape the violence. The country's agricultural system has been devastated, and the crops have been destroyed, leaving 1.7 million people food insecure. USAID estimates 2.5 million people in the CAR require humanitarian assistance. That's why in April, the UN Security Council voted unanimously to deploy a UN peacekeeping mission to the Central African Republic. And now it's time for this committee to act, to do our part, and to prevent the humanitarian crisis in the CAR from continuing any further. The amendment I'm offering today can make all the difference. First, the amendment would add $100 million in transfer authority to the Bilateral Economic Assistance Fund, which would also give the State Department flexibility to use peacekeeping funds for the CAR mission. Second, it would add $100 million to pay for assessed expenses of international peacekeeping activities. This would allow the State Department to use these funds for the UN mission in the CAR. Mr. Chairman, as appropriator, our constituents have trusted us with using their hard-earned tax dollars to make smart investments in our future. Preventing this further escalation of violence in the CAR is not only the right thing to do, but it will save us money down the line. The CAR's security situation is increasingly perilous and threatens to further destabilize an already conflict-ridden region. Its neighbors like the DRC and South Sudan are burdened by civil war. Another neighbor, Nigeria, has already become a breeding ground for extremist ideology and terror groups like Boko Haram. The places where extremist ideology flourish are those where uneducated young people are economically disenfranchised. If the conflict in the CAR continues, then these conditions will also almost certainly develop. Allowing the CAR to become a hotbed is also irresponsible and preventable. That's why it's so important that we invest now in the international peacekeeping operations in the CAR. It has been discussed in the previous amendment that it is 8 times more expensive to use force in such regions with such situations. It's also easy to point out we are a war-weary country. We are surrounded in a world with conflicts. It is our job to do the best we can to avoid them before they become conflicts, because not only are we a war-weary country, our Army is as well. I encourage your adoption.
Chairman Granger.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. The House bill already makes available $150 million to support urgent peacekeeping needs if it's necessary to address urgent humanitarian needs and vital to our national security interests. This is the same funding level as that in the budget request. If additional needs arise, the State Department also has transfer authorities that can be used if the committee is notified. I oppose the gentleman's amendment.
Is there further discussion? Ms. Lowy?
I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Quigley, for addressing this issue. The amendment would ensure that the United States can more fully support a peacekeeping mission in the Central African Republic, a country that is being torn by sectarian divisions and violent conflicts. So I do rise in support of this amendment.
There being no further discussion, the gentleman is recognized to close.
Mr. Chairman, I recognize for members of this committee and those who are watching that it seems like there's no end to the need, and that our abilities to handle these issues may be overwhelming. But I do believe that there are critical issues and critical junctures and critical points in this world that we have to address. And I think, unfortunately, if we don't address them now, they're just going to be far more expensive in the future. And with all due respect, it will probably be too late for the nearly millions who could possibly face, or certainly face genocide if nothing more is done. I encourage your support.
On the Quigley amendment, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no.
No.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. McCollum, page 218, after line 24, insert the following: limitation on funds for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development for the Chernobyl New Safe Confinement Project.
Mr. Chairman, we can waive it.
That objection, the waiver is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment prohibits funds at the Chernobyl New Safe Confinement Project managed by the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development and the Ukrainian government. Cleaning up this former Soviet nuclear disaster and creating a safe, secure environment at Chernobyl is a goal I support, and I'm sure all of you do as well. Unfortunately, this project has faced a history of cost overruns, expensive delays, mismanagement, including a total lack of transparency on the part of Ukrainian regulators. Now, we all know that the Ukrainian, under their former regime, was one of the most corrupt countries in the world in which to do business. And it appears this project has been a cash cow. And I'm from a dairy state, so I can tell you what a cash cow is all about. My amendment is intended to get the attention of the EBRD and put them on notice that Congress demands oversight, accountability, and effective management of this project if U.S. taxpayers are going to be asked to contribute $1 more. Now, I thank the chairwoman and the ranking member for putting some language into the legislation before us today, but I believe it needs more, and here's why. Over the past 15 years, the United States, as a result of the work of this Appropriations Committee, has been a major donor to this project. After an initial U.S. contribution of $240 million to the Chernobyl project, the EBRD announced in 2011 that the project would be completed in 2015 at a cost of $2 billion. The U.S. responded by pledging an additional $123 million to complete the project, and some of those funds are in the bill before us today. To date, the U.S. is one of 43 donors and has contributed more than 25% of the total donor funds to this project. But here we go again. In 2014, another funding shortfall and more donor funds will be needed to complete the project. Now it's estimated that at least an additional $600 to $800 million in donor funds will be needed on this project. To be assured, U.S. taxpayers and other donors will be asked by the EBRD once again to pay the final cleanup for this former Soviet Union disaster. Russia, too, has been a donor, but I suspect Mr. Putin's a little too busy carving off territory from the former Ukraine to concern himself with Chernobyl's cleanup or cleaning up the corruption. So it's critically important that this project not be any farther out of financial control. My amendment sends a strong message to the EBRD that they need to get control of the cost and management before asking the U.S. for any more funds. This amendment prevents any additional U.S. funds to this project until some basic conditions are met. One, the committee must be provided with an honest, realistic, and achievable cost estimate to finish the project. The committee must be provided with any additional requests for U.S. taxpayer funds, a final number. The role of the Ukrainian regulators must be clarified so that they're adding value to the project and not just adding to the cost of the project. And finally, the EBRD must address the millions of dollars of uncompensated, out-of-pocket material and labor costs inflicted on U.S. companies caught in the Ukrainian dysfunctional regulatory system. Congress must not be a cash cow for the BERD or for Ukrainian officials. While the U.S. firms are left uncompensated for their contribution to this project's critical success. Once again, I want to be clear. I want this project to succeed. We need to clean up this mess left by the former Soviet Union in the Chernobyl area. But when the EBRD can prove to this committee that this project is accountable and transparent and on a way to completion, then and only then should I believe this committee be restoring funding. So I want to thank the committee's attention on this, and here's just two facts. In 2011, the EBRD said final cost of the environmental safety to Chernobyl is $2 billion. Donors filled an $800 million funding gap. In 2014, the bank came back to us again and said the new estimate for the final project is $2.72 billion. An estimated funding gap is $600 to $800 million. We need transparency, we need oversight, and we do need to clean it up. Mr. Chair, thank you for the time.
Chairman Granger.
I oppose this amendment. The committee report already addresses oversight, transparency, and accountability issues related to this project, but including this language would set a bad precedent for this committee. My understanding is that this amendment would address concerns for one or two U.S. companies operating in Ukraine. This committee can't replace the appeals process for contractors overseas. I also oppose the amendment because it would hold up funds for Ukraine for the Chernobyl cleanup. No funds for Ukraine should be held up given the current events in that region, and I oppose the amendment.
Ms. Louie.
I rise in support of the amendment. The U.S. companies under contract for this project have been subject to significant cost overruns and non-payment for work performed caused primarily by extensive, questionable delays inflicted by Ukrainian regulatory bodies. So I rise in support of the amendment.
Mr. Quigley.
Mr. Chairman, I was in Ukraine with Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel about a month ago, and we met with former President Yanukovych's Chief of Staff and talked about this very issue. And I support this amendment because of what he talked to us about. I understand there are issues in the language that deal with transparency, but given the discussions we had, the nature of the problems with this reactor, it's not just environmental issues, it's safety issues, it's terrorism issues, and we have to make sure that the resources that go there are used effectively. To vote against this and assume that it'll all get worked out and not send any messages that the money has to be used well may very well mean that it doesn't get done and those safety concerns aren't addressed effectively and appropriately. So I think this is probably the best way to move forward, assuring that the job actually gets done and the region is safer and has its environment protected.
Ms. McCullum's recognized to close.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In closing, I want to emphasize that this amendment is not an attack on the goals of this project. Cleaning up the Chernobyl nuclear site should be a priority, but we cannot continue to fund this project and watch the continued costs rise and rise and rise due to poor management. Therefore, we must appropriate or pledge any additional funds going forward to make sure that they ensure transparency and accountability. And I'm not going to be embarrassed to say that American companies doing difficult but vital work in this project are fully paid with U.S. tax dollars rather than going into the pockets of corrupt bureaucrats. So I urge adoption of this amendment. I thank the members.
Question is on McCullum's amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. No. The noes seem to have it.
Mr. Chair, I request a roll call.
Roll call is requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Feelinghuisen? Mr. Feelinghuisen, no. Ms. Granger?
No.
Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Ferrer-Butler? Ms. Ferrer-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter?
Aye.
Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Latham? Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy? Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor? Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf? No. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no.
Do members wish to change votes? Gentlelady?
Gentlelady is recorded as a no.
Are there members who wish to vote or change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 20, the nays are 25. The amendment is not agreed to. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now I'm standing to, I rise to offer an amendment. I have an amendment at the desk on family planning.
Clerk will read.
This is number one.
Which number?
Family
I don't know them by number. It's the one on family planning.
One's on page 185 and one's on page 202.
Forgive me, but thanks. Didn't know them.
Amendment offered by Ms. Wasserman-Schultz.
I asked for a waiver of the reading.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would lift the cap that the committee, Mark, has in place for funding for family planning. Time and again, domestically and internationally, we have data that shows that about access and information to family planning decreases unwanted pregnancies and abortions. The more information and access to information about family planning and how to space pregnancies that women internationally and nationally have, the less likely it is that they become pregnant with an unwanted, unplanned pregnancy. Empowering women with information about their reproductive health, as well as prenatal and postnatal care, helps ensure that mothers and babies are healthy and safe. And I'm sure that we all want to see that all across the globe. Worldwide, these are staggering statistics. Every year, 53 million women experience unintended pregnancies, and 25 million women obtain abortions. Family planning is critical to reducing those numbers and further contributes to reduced maternal and infant mortality and healthier babies and children. Family planning education not only benefits women and children, but has the potential to benefit entire communities and nations. When women and men are able to plan their families, they're in a better position to budget their resources most effectively and able to plan for investing in their children. Repeated evidence shows that when women understand how to space out their pregnancies, they have healthier babies. Those babies grow into healthier adults who perform better at school and ultimately contribute more to economic development. I think that there's not a person in this room that wouldn't agree with those goals. So it's sort of inexplicable why we would cap the family planning funding in this bill at the level that it's at. Family planning also helps girls stay in school longer, receive more education, and enter and remain in the workforce, contributing to overall economic growth. I want to be clear that this amendment is not about abortion, not at all. It's about making sure that we can target communities and families all across the globe to make it less likely that an abortion is necessary. In the President's fiscal year 14 budget request, President Obama proposed $644 million for USAID and the State Department family planning efforts. That would have been a $34 million increase over the final amount appropriated for FY14. While we certainly don't have to appropriate exactly what was in the President's budget. In contrast, this year's bill proposes capping this account at $461 million, almost $200 million less. That does not make sense, and it's counter to what we all say about what we want to see worldwide when it comes to family planning and reducing the need for abortions. So I urge adoption of the amendment.
Chairman Granger.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. I do not support this amendment being included in the bill, and I urge a no vote.
Ms. Lowy.
I rise in support of my colleague's amendment to strike the arbitrary limit on family planning programs in this bill. Family planning programs are an extremely effective way for the United States to support women around the world in improving their own health and that of their families. Global estimates indicate that by helping women space their births and avoid unintended pregnancies, family planning could prevent 25% of maternal and child deaths in the developing world. In addition, family planning is the most effective way to prevent abortion, unwanted pregnancies, and study after study shows that when women have access to contraceptives, the incidence of abortion decreases. The conversation we should be having is how to increase these programs and the impact they are having instead of trying to limit them. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Further discussion? Hearing none. The gentlelady is recognized to close. The question is on Wasserman Schultz. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Roll call is requested. A sufficient show. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Aye. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. Aye. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Farr. Aye. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fattah. Aye. Mr. Fattah, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. No. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Ms. Granger.
No.
Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Hura Butler. Ms. Hura Butler, no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Aye. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston. Mr. Latham. Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee. Aye. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy.
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran.
Aye.
Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally. Mr. Owens.
Aye.
Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor. Ms. Pingree.
Aye.
Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf.
No.
Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no.
Are the members wish to be recorded? Chairman Freeling.
Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye.
Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Mr. Diaz-Balart, no.
Do members wish to change vote? Clerk will call the roll. Will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 20, the nays are 26. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Laurel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. DeLauro.
I ask
In
unanimous
section.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Gentlelady is recognized.
My amendment strikes the prohibition on funding for the United Nations Population Fund, the largest multilateral family planning and reproductive health leader in the world, and it inserts the President's request of $35.3 million for UNFPA. As currently written, this bill denies basic family planning and health services to women. It leaves women vulnerable to preventable diseases, weakens their ability to contribute to their family and communities' economic stability. UNFPA is a world leader in implementing effective voluntary family planning policies and programs that contribute to the U.S. Comprehensive Strategy for Sustainable Development. UNFPA is also leading the world's coordinated efforts to prevent and repair obstetric fistula, a tragic and preventable condition caused by days of prolonged labor and the resulting rotting away of internal tissue. Women around the world are suffering in this unspeakable way because of child marriage, early pregnancy, lack of maternity care, or even because their husbands would not let them go to the hospital. Cannot understand why we continue to target family planning programs when the evidence shows time and again that these programs lead to fewer unwanted pregnancies, fewer abortions, and fewer maternal and infant deaths. To be clear, the United States does not and cannot fund abortions. To be clear, the United States does not and cannot fund abortions. The Helms Amendment in 1973 to the Foreign Assistance Act prohibits the use of foreign assistance funds to pay for the performance of abortion as a method of family planning or to motivate or coerce any person to practice abortions, and that's a quote. This amendment does not change any of the current provisions in law restricting the use of family planning funds. This amendment also maintains language prohibiting the use of U.S. funds by UNFPA for their China Country program, prohibits the use of U.S. funds for UNFPA for their China Country program. It maintains reductions in U.S. contributions to UNFPA, dollar for dollar, in the amount that UNFPA spends of its own money in China. And the amendment maintains the requirement that UNFPA establish a separate account so that U.S. contributions are not commingled with other contributions. Put simply, this amendment maintains current law. Mr. Chairman, with only a small investment, we can have a profound impact on women's health around the world. I urge my colleagues to support improving the health of women around the world through the implementation of an effective voluntary family planning policies and programs by supporting this amendment.
Chairman Granger.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. I do not support this amendment being included in this bill, and I urge a no vote.
Ms. Lowy.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of this amendment.
Further discussion? Mr. Idaho.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I just want to point out for 3 decades that UNFPA has been widely denounced for its involvement in the China one-child policy, which relies on forced abortions, and yet it has not only steadily refused to sever its link with the Chinese government, it has promoted the government's policy as a model for the world. The United States has always been on the side of the victim and not the perpetrator of injustice. By ignoring the Kemp Kasten, the U.S. government sends a message to oppressive governments that coercive abortion and other human rights violations are not a big deal. We not only give a green light to abusive governments to continue their abuse, to abuse their people without repercussion, we also signal that we will fund organizations that support and subsidize their programs. So I would ask that we vote no on the amendment, and I yield back.
Ms. McCollum.
Mr. Chair, could I ask the gentleman what he's using to cite his facts? Because there was a report that came out that was very clear that UNFPA was not involved in supporting the China One policy. Could you tell me where you got your information from, please?
That is my understanding. I have been given that information. Do you have, what are you citing that would...
If I could ask Ms. Delora to yield, please, Mr. Chair.
The gentlelady is correct, and I said in my remarks that what the amendment does, it clearly does, it prohibits the use of U.S. funds by UNFPA for their China country program. It maintains the reductions in U.S. contributions to UNFPA dollar for dollar in the amount that UNFPA spends of its own money in China. So I don't know where the information comes from that disputes what is in fact data and information that is known and that we have been speaking about continuously in this effort. We are not talking about any abridgment of current law in the United States.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Oh, I'll be happy to.
Is there a...
McCollum controls.
Oh, I don't have the time. The gentlewoman has the time.
Mr. Chair, this is the first time this has happened to me. I need parliamentarian advice on how to let these two people get the facts straight. I yield to Mr. Adderholt.
Correct.
Can we cite where that comes from?
Ask your question, and then I'll
My question would be, is there a commingling of funds in this?
No, I also said that...
Gentlelady, you yield to the gentlelady.
I'm learning how to do this.
Okay.
Okay?
Who's
So
on first?
I yield to Ms. Delora.
Thank you very much, Ms. McCollum. The amendment maintains the requirement that UNFPA establish a separate account so that U.S. contributions are not commingled with other contributions. So on every measure that the gentleman has voiced a view on, there is the data which suggests that that is not the case.
Thank you. And reclaiming my time, this is an issue when I first came to Congress, there was a lot of discussion and debate around. And there was a report, it was presented, we debated it on the floor, that in fact UNFPA does not support, there's no commingling of fund with China's one policy. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the parliamentarian experts for having a successful dialogue, and I yield back.
Congratulations.
You'll make some time.
Mr. Fortenberry.
Regardless of the issue of the specifics of China, the UNFPA is very entangled with the abortion industry. That's the reality here. Money is fungible. This is a most egregious violation of human rights in their past history. We had a woman from the African continent come before the Foreign Affairs Committee when I was there, and she chided us for imposing an abortion worldview on her continent. inferring that this is another form of neocolonialism, exporting the most divisive aspects of our culture onto other people. I think that what we should be focused on primarily is sustainable development for the poor, food security, and inclusive capitalism. That represents the highest and best noble ideals in our foreign diplomacy. That builds mutual trust. And I think that creates international stability as well as our own national security. And that's the underlying purpose of this law. So I'm going to oppose this amendment.
Chairman Wolf.
I yield to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Granger.
Thank you. Although I oppose this amendment, I want to say that I do share the gentlewoman's concern about obstetric fistula and increased USAID's funding level by $2 million because of that. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Simpson.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to my friend from Alabama, Mr. Adderholt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just checking with my staff about that, and I did want to respond to the where those statistics came from. This is from a 2008 report from the State Department. It issued a report that shows clear involvement. In fact, according to the report, UNFPA funds money to the very Chinese agencies that enforce coercive abortion policy. So just wanted to clarify that for the record.
There being no further discussion, the gentlelady is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. UNFPA programs complement our government-funded voluntary family planning programs. They work in over 100 countries where the United States government does not have a reproductive health or family planning presence. UNFPA is a world leader in developing a coordinated effort to prevent and to repair obstetric fistula. If you don't know anything about it, please read about it and look at the devastation that it wreaks on women overseas. They do so much more. Refugee camps, women and girls are especially vulnerable to sexual assault, exploitation, to trafficking. Even going out to find clean water and food puts them at high risk. UNFPA prioritizes programs that provide security to women and girls in refugee camps, promotes access to water, to food, to health care for women and girls. It is able to quickly respond to natural, man-made disasters to reestablish maternal health services. The funding is essential to global health goals, and it improves the health and well-being of populations in other countries, but those especially, I make the case for women and children. And despite what our own philosophies or ideologies are, to help women and children around the world, I think is a moral responsibility that we do have in this institution and on this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Question is on the DeLauro amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Show of hands for a recorded vote. A sufficient number. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro.
Aye.
Mr. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Feelinghuisen. Mr. Feelinghuisen, aye. Ms. Granger.
No.
Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Hira Butler. Ms. Hira Butler, no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston. Mr. Latham. Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy.
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran.
Aye.
Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor. Ms. Pingree.
Aye.
Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf?
No.
Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded or to change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 20, the nays are 26. The amendment is not agreed to. It's sort of getting warm in here. Mr. Simpson, do you know a good fan company we could? Never mind. Mr. Schiff? Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Schiff. At the appropriate place in the committee report, insert the following. As the United States continues making progress towards ending discrimination.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've made remarkable strides in this country in terms of respecting all of our fellow citizens, but in too many parts of the world, people in the LGBT community face discrimination, violence, and death. In many parts of Africa and the former Soviet bloc, homosexuality is being criminalized or recriminalized in ways that are truly frightening and ugly. In some countries, people are being threatened with life in prison or the death penalty simply for being who they are. My amendment urges the Department of State to continue to press other governments to repeal these harsh and discriminatory laws and to refrain from enacting new ones. This country has always stood for freedom and with the oppressed, and my amendment is in that finest tradition of American foreign policy, and I urge its adoption.
Chairman Granger?
I would hope the gentleman would withdraw his amendment. These issues are a priority with the State Department, and they have stated that numerous times. There's no need for an amendment, and so I would request that you withdraw yours.
Ms. Lloyd?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the report language offered by my colleague, Mr. Schiff. Although Uganda's anti-gay laws have made headlines in the past few months, there are currently 76 countries where homosexuality is illegal. Penalties ranging from a slap on the wrist to death by public stoning, with forced psychiatric treatment, whippings, lifelong prison sentences in between. Anti-LGBT gay laws have negative consequences for all members of society, particularly in the fight to stop the spread of HIV/AIDS. In some countries, individuals infected with HIV, including children, now risk losing access to medical care because some clinics that serve any LGBT clients are shut down. The administration articulated its support for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons in the December 6, 2011 Presidential Memorandum on International initiatives to advance the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons. I urge my colleagues to support the report language proposed by Mr. Schiff, and I yield back.
Mr. Schiff is recognized to close.
I thank the Chairman. I appreciate my Chair's interest in withdrawing the amendment, but I'm not clear, I guess, on what's being proposed. If the Chair is willing to work on language that encourages the State Department to make this a priority, if there's a problem with this particular language, then I'm more than willing to work with the Chair. If there's simply a desire, though, not to prioritize this, then I cannot agree to withdraw it and would urge support. If there's a willingness to continue working on this and find mutually agreed upon language, I'm more than happy to withdraw. Otherwise,
I'll work with you on it.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman for her agreement to work on this and would be happy to withdraw and yield back.
Amendment is withdrawn. Further amendments. Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Moran.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized.
And, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to spare you the arguments on the Guantanamo issue.
Oh, please.
Really? I'm not going to do that this time, but there is unique language in this bill that would deny any foreign aid funds to any country that accepts detainee transfers from Guantanamo Bay. So it's a very harsh threat, really, to any country that engages in good faith negotiations with the United States. We have 78 detainees that have been cleared for transfer by our intelligence communities and by the Department of Defense. It seems to me it's in our interest to be able to move forward on some or even all of those transfers at some point. We've got the authorization for the use of military force expiring and a number of legal issues on whether we can continue to detain them. And there's the other issue that it's costing us $2.9 million per detainee per year. Now, particularly for the 78 that have been cleared for transfer, it doesn't seem to me we should have such strong language deterring any country from entering into negotiations with us. And you've heard the other points with regard to Guantanamo. I'd be happy to hear from our very distinguished friend, the chair of the committee, though, on her response to this.
Chairman's recognized.
Thank you very much. I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment, but I believe there's just a disagreement because the amendment says to strike a provision in the bill that requires the administration to notify the committee when they conclude an agreement with the country to transfer the detainees. So we may disagree on Guantanamo policy, but I'd hope we'd agree that the committee should be informed about when agreements are made with countries receiving U.S. assistance.
Mr. Chairman, to wrap up here, I'm aware of that. Certainly my amendment would leave that provision that the administration is required to notify the committee. And for that reason, I will withdraw the amendment.
Oh.
Sorry to disappoint you.
Amendment is withdrawn. Ms. Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Offered by Ms. Lee, strike subsection B of section 7063 on page 38.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, I just have to say it's really shameful that there's language in this bill that would reinstate the very harmful global gag rule, also known as the Mexico City policy. Now, this rider would block funds from organizations that provide critical health services to the poorest women in the world unless that organization agrees not to use its own private, non-United States funds, mind you, its own private, non-United States funds to provide any service related in any way to abortion. Now, if that's not government overreach, I really don't know what is. This amendment, which I'm offering today, would just simply strike the language in the bill and make no other changes. We already know, and we've heard earlier, that the Helms Amendment has, since 1973, prohibited the use of federal funds to provide or promote abortion services. Now, while I totally disagree with this policy, and I strongly believe that we should be actively working to lessen federal restrictions on access to health services, and we should repeal the Helms Amendment once and for all. It is the current law. This amendment does nothing to the current law. We absolutely should not, however, be legislating more restrictions which are contained in this appropriations bill. The misguided Mexico City policy is really incredibly counterproductive. When in place, this policy interferes with the doctor-patient relationship by restricting accurate information healthcare providers may offer. In fact, according to the World Health Organization, more than 500,000 women, 99% of whom live in developing countries, die each year from childbirth-related causes. It's clear that this policy does nothing but harm the health of these women. That's why I'm joining our ranking member Lowy and others in supporting a permanent repeal of the Global Gag Act, which is the Global Democracy Promotion Act, which would ensure U.S. foreign policy promotes freedom of speech around the world. But this amendment only strikes the language in this bill which plays really political games with women's health. I urge my colleagues to support this. Once again, it does not repeal current law.
Chairman Granger.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. I respectfully disagree, and I urge a no vote.
Ms. Loy.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of my friend Ms. Lee's amendment. Reinstating the global gag rule would severely erode the recent progress we've made on maternal and child health and access to family planning services. Instead of making it more difficult for women to access quality care, we should be supporting programs that help women and their partners make decisions to ensure their health and the health of their families. I strongly urge my colleagues to support the Lee amendment and remove this counterproductive provision.
Ms. Roby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition. I just want to remind members of the committee that the majority of Americans absolutely abhor the thought of their taxpayer dollars going to fund abortion, and so I oppose this.
Gentlelady is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, I want to reiterate, and I don't want to mislead the public, that this amendment would allow taxpayer dollars to fund abortions. That's just not the case. The Helms Amendment remains in place, and so it's very disingenuous to say that that's what this amendment does. All this does is one thing, and that's just allow organizations to use their own private, non-United States funds to provide any service that they so desire. That's the least we can do. It does nothing with current law that allows taxpayer dollars for abortions. And so I just want to be clear, just in case anyone's confused about that, it does not repeal the Helms Amendment. Majority of Americans from across ideological spectrums, they support the current administration's policy, which does not impose such ideological restrictions on women's health. Thank you, and I yield.
The question is on the Lee amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no.
No. May I have a recorded vote?
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Recorded vote is requested. Those in support will raise their right hand. A sufficient number, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fattah? Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger?
No.
Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Hura Butler? Ms. Hura Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Latham? Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy? Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum? Ms. McCollum, aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor? Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Viscoski? Mr. Viscoski, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf?
No.
Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded or change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 19, the nays are 26. The amendment is not agreed to. Ms. Wasserman Schultz,
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. It's amendment number 2.
clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms.
And
Wasserman
I ask
Schultz.
for a waiver of the reading of the bill.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would remove the provision, and I offer this amendment, Mr. Chairman, at the risk of ending up with coal in my stocking from you later this year, but be that as it may, I offer the amendment to remove the provision that would essentially require the World Bank, the Exim Bank, and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation to exclusively support coal energy in developing countries at the expense of clean, renewable, and new technologies for energy production. The provision that I'm striking has been represented to be protective of American jobs. The reality is that this provision will do the opposite of its stated intent, hampering creation in the fields of renewable energy and technology and clean technology. Over the past decades, and these are important facts and statistics that I hope members will pay close attention to. Over the past decades, the coal mining industry has become much more mechanized and capital intensive, meaning that the number of actual workers has decreased dramatically. And I understand that many of these are concentrated in just a few states, and some are truly reliant on the coal industry for employment. But if we really want to talk about American jobs, let's just look at the numbers. While the Bureau of Labor Statistics indicates that about 90,000 people work directly in coal mining as of November 2013, the American solar industry employed nearly 143,000 people, a jump of 20% in just 1 year. The number of people working in the global renewable energy industry grew by 14% to 6.5 million people in 2013. In the United States alone, there are more than 600,000 people working in this field. We cannot let China and other competitive nations continue to outpace us in investments and job creation in these fields. The language in this bill threatens to do that. It will put this nation at a disadvantage as other countries step in with their innovations in new energy technology and production that so many countries in the developing world are desperate to acquire. Already, China has established itself as the largest player in the field of solar technology harvesting, even though that technology was pioneered in the United States. The administration's Power Africa initiative offers a fantastic platform for U.S. investment to spark energy production and growth. Exim and OPIC are integral to this initiative. We have startups all over this country ready to export their technology and hire a lot of people to do it. Many of them will look to financing from Exim and from OPIC. Finally, at the risk of staying very much on the topic of foreign operations, this is simply bad policy. As countries in the developing world seek to build their capacity, most are seeking renewable, clean energy options. The rural village in sub-Saharan Africa on the equator needs solar panels. It does not need coal mining technology. Don't misunderstand me. Coal mining technology can be an option, but it should not be the only option. And the language in this bill makes it the only option. This provision would limit the options of developing nations rather than providing them the tools based in American innovation to one day become energy independent, to say nothing of the pollution that would begin to proliferate. Climate change and global warming are real. Yesterday, NOAA recorded the highest average Earth temperature since they began recording Earth's temperature in 1880. The average worldwide temperature yesterday was 59.93 degrees Fahrenheit. We have to make it possible for us to have renewable options, and we need to be able to export them so we can create jobs here in America from exporting all over the world. If we don't, we're going to risk the impact to our peril. We have a responsibility as a global leader to lead, and to our children to lead the way in supporting innovative renewable technologies that advance clean energy around the world and spur new workforce development here at home. It's not reasonable to limit the technology that we export to one type of finite fossil fuel. The impact of coal-fired technology doesn't only make it harder to breathe in China, it impacts sea level rise in South Florida and our weather all across this country. And I urge us not to be so narrow and limiting in the language in this bill and make sure that we can create jobs in all kinds of industries all across America. Thank you.
I'm feeling like Frank Wolf now. Look, I've lost 8,000 miners in my district alone in the last 18 months. We've got families that formerly were working for good wages that now can't even get a job at a McDonald's with a family. And they're having to uproot their entire life and move somewhere else because of this administration's war on coal. And it's real. There's a lot of refugees in my district from this war. Now, the nation gets about half of its power for electricity from coal. But overseas, this amendment would undo the only bright spot in the fossil fuel industry's sky, and that is exports. Not just coal, but for turbines and the equipment and the building materials that go into building power plants. The administration's policies would have XM, OPEC, the World Bank not be able to finance overseas construction of fossil fuel generating plants. This amendment would strike coal as one of the fuel sources that could be used. The gentlelady's mistaken when she says what she has said. All this amendment, the policies that we're pushing, and in this bill, the language that's there now, would add coal to those fossil fuels overseas that could be financed. Now this is anti-jobs here, it's anti-jobs there. And it's not just coal, nor even oil, or even natural gas, any fossil fuel. It's about the companies in this country that sell products to overseas that construct these plants and all that goes with them, and the pipelines and the like. So I would urge that we reject this new assault in the war on coal and fossil fuels in general. And because if you prohibit Americans from shipping overseas the coal, the natural gas even, and the oil supplies and the like, any fossil fuel, and you prohibit American companies from being involved there, where do you think they'll turn? They're going to build those plants. They'll turn to China with this terrible environmental record. And you'll hurt the world problem more than you're trying to help it here. So I urge a rejection of this amendment. Chairman Granger.
I rise in opposition to this amendment. The administration's regulations have hurt our nation's exports, our economy, and ultimately our ability to provide power to those most in need overseas. Now is not the time to cut U.S. businesses out of any competition. The administration's policies could also cause countries to look for financing from places, as the chairman mentioned, with lower environmental standards than ours, such as China. I support the chairman's effort to address these issues, and I oppose the amendment.
Ms. Lowy.
With great respect to our chairman, I rise in support of my colleague Debbie Wasserman Schultz's amendment. Just a few statistics. Bloomberg estimates $254 billion in new investment in clean energy in 2013, including $121 billion in Asia, $66 billion in the Americas, and $68 billion in Europe and the Middle East. The United States has a growing renewable energy sector. We should help entrepreneurs expand clean energy initiatives, create the jobs of the future to help both the United States and developing countries boost their economies and preserve the environment for generations to come. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz will stand by. Mr. Farr.
I have a question for you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the causes in your state, but I want to know, is this just exclusive to coal? One of the fastest growing industry in California is alternative energy. And it's a huge employer, very labor intensive. We don't burn any coal in our region at all. Very little burnt in California. So, I mean, our industry's on the growth mode. It's investment, it's technology that's being invested overseas. Does this amendment restrict that kind of investment?
The only industry excluded from export financing by the administration is just coal. All other sources are okay, but they single out coal as being not something that could be financed by these sources. The language in the bill simply adds coal to the list of options allowed for energy financing measures.
So it doesn't prohibit any investment in any other alternative energy?
No.
Exportation?
It just adds coal to those items that could be exported. The gentlelady is recognized to close.
Thank you. I beg to differ with the chairman. The language in the underlying bill restricts the investment to only coal. And if you vote against this amendment, then essentially what you're saying is that if you have an energy company that wants to make an investment through OPIC, through Exim, they won't be able to, because we're limiting the language in this bill to only investments in coal technology. I don't know why we'd vote against jobs in each and every one of our districts, but that's what the language of the underlying bill does. And what my language does is it doesn't eliminate coal. It simply says that we're not going to limit it exclusively to coal. So I urge adoption of the amendment.
The question is on the Wasserman-Schultz amendment. All in favor say aye. All opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Moran?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd rise to be recognized raise an issue pertinent to this subcommittee. I might be recognized.
The gentleman's recognized.
I won't take the 5 minutes. Mr. Chairman, this is with regard to our leaving Afghanistan. And as we do, we're finding that a number of the people who were most helpful to us while we were there, such as interpreters to our military, are being targeted by the Taliban for execution along with their families. There is a special immigrant visa. For several years, it was very ineffectual. It's starting to function now, but it has a cap of 1,000. There is a bill, it's a bipartisan bill. Mr. Kinzinger and Mr. Blumenauer in the House, as well as myself and Senator McCain and Shaheen in the Senate, have this bill, but the Armed Services Authorization only included 1,000 new visas. There's a need for at least 4,000. These are people who are systematically being targeted because the Taliban knows they were cooperating with us in instrumental ways. I was hoping that we could get some language in the bill. I fully understand the context, and I'm not asking for any language in this bill, but if there is a chance in conference with the Senate to increase this visa cap to enable those people whose lives are endangered solely because they were instrumentally helpful to us to be able to get over here to the United States with their immediate families, I would hope that the chairman and ranking member would be receptive to putting such language in the conference report. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Granger.
Thank you for raising this issue, and I know it's not addressed in the bill, but it's a matter that many members care deeply about. The House extended the program when it passed the National Defense Authorization Act earlier this year, And I understand the language in that bill was the result of a compromise between the House Armed Services Committee and the Judiciary Committee. I also understand that the Senate Armed Services Committee has reported a bill that provides for a broader extension of the program. So it's my hope that these committees can work out their differences and address this issue. I'll keep working with you on it.
Ms. Lowy?
I just want to thank you for bringing to our attention this very important issue. In fact, I believe we fund in our bill organizations that are committed to rescuing scholars and others who have performed really valiant services, and I look forward to working with you. Thank you very much.
Well, I thank the chair and ranking member very much, and I think we're in complete agreement, and the issue is not with really armed services or appropriations. Judiciary obviously doesn't want to do anything. That's their a jurisdiction, probably because it raises the immigration issue, which is too problematic for them. But I very much thank the chair and ranking member. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any final amendments? Hearing none, recognize Mr. Wolf for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move to favorably report the State and Foreign Operations Appropriation Bill for fiscal year 2015 to the House.
You've heard the motion. All in favor say aye. All opposed will say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. 3 days' notice is allowed. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be given the authority to make technical and conforming change to the items approved today. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned. All right. Well, that turned out pretty good.